What is going on, everybody? Welcome to Guys That Magic. I am your host, Dave, and today I am going to be taking you through a deck tech, one of the new cards from Phyrexia All Will Be One. This is Graaz Unstoppable Juggernaut. This is going to be quite a bit of a fun deck. This is a colorless EDH deck, so there are quite a bit of restrictions with that in mind. You don't get to play any cards with any colors. However, Graaz actually does have quite a bit of additional fun that he brings into the table. So we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about the overall strategy for this deck, what this deck wants to do, what it's good at, what it's bad at, and ultimately let you decide, is this something that you would be interested in playing? So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and dive in. Graaz Unstoppable Juggernaut is 8 generic mana for a legendary artifact creature Juggernaut. It's a 7/5. It says that Juggernauts you control attack each combat if able. Juggernauts you control can't be blocked by walls. Other creatures you control have base power and toughness 5/3 and are Juggernauts in addition to their other creature types. So a lot to unpack here. He is incredibly expensive. 7/5 is pretty solid. However, 5 toughness is not the biggest in the world. He does have to attack every turn, which is totally fine considering it's got 7 power. You probably don't want this thing sitting back on blocks. It also can't be blocked by walls or any of your other creatures for that matter, so long as Graaz is in play, which I don't know if that's good, bad, or even relevant, to be completely honest with you. There aren't very many walls that see play in EDH. What you're really going to be playing Graaz for is that third ability where you're going to be able to turn all of your other creatures into 5/3 Juggernauts. They are going to have to attack every combat if able. So do keep in mind, this is not going to be a deck for people who enjoy blocking. But if you like swinging in with big smashy things, this could be right up your alley. So we're going to go ahead and talk about some of the creatures that are included in this deck. The first group of creatures we're going to mention, these are for the most part just going to be included because although they're not really all that great on their own, they're pretty solid whenever they happen to be 5/3s. So the first one here is Darksteel Mirror. This is 3 mana for an artifact creature mirror. It's a 0/1 with Indestructible, allowing you to continuously beat down with that 5/3 version of this card so long as Graaz is in play. Spectrum Sentinel is a single mana for an artifact creature soldier. It is a 1/2 with protection from multicolored, and it says whenever a non-basic land enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, you gain 1 life. Hover Mirror is 2 generic mana for an artifact creature mirror. It is a 1/2 with flying and vigilance, so a couple of relevant keywords that we would love to have stapled onto that 5/3. And then the next 2 cards are actually not entirely dead on their own. They're actually somewhat solid still, but have quite a bit of upside past that point. The first one here is Etched Champion. It is 3 generic mana for an artifact creature soldier. It's a 2/2 with Metalcraft and says it has protection from all colors as long as you control 3 or more artifacts, which is going to be very easy to do in this deck. The other one that I was alluding to is Liberator Urza's Battlethopter. This is 3 generic mana for a legendary artifact creature Thopter. It's a 1/2 with flash and flying, and it says that you may cast colorless spells and artifact spells as though they had flash. It also says whenever you cast a spell, if the amount of mana spent to cast that spell is greater than Liberator Battlethopter's power, put a +1/+1 counter on Liberator. So it does have the potential to grow. Keep in mind, if you are going to be casting things once Graaz is in play, it gets a little bit funky. But, I mean, this hopefully should still be able to grow, and it's got some very relevant keywords and abilities there. We do have 3 cards in this list that are dedicated just kind of to pumping our team, making sure that they're not just going to be 5/3s, giving a little bit more of a power and toughness booster, some more relevant abilities. The first one here is Steel Overseer. This is 2 mana for an artifact creature construct. It is a 1/1 that you can tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on each artifact creature you control. Chief of the Foundry is 3 mana for an artifact creature construct, and it says other artifact creatures you control get +1/+1. So both of these are going to help to make sure that your team gets a bit bigger. Steel Overseer obviously going to be able to grow a little bit bigger with being able to put down the +1/+1 counters on things, but definitely both are really nice. The other one here is Crypto Thrall. This is 4 mana for an artifact creature construct. It's a 3/3 and it says Protector. Other artifact creatures you control have hexproof. This is really nice and very important to the deck because Graaz is still actually somewhat fragile, and if we do end up losing our commander, not only does he cost just about 1,000,000 mana, but it's kind of a pain in the butt because it shuts down so many other avenues of our deck. We do have a couple of other creatures included in here. These are just going to be, for the most part, value town creatures. The first one here is Endbringer. This is 5 and a colorless for a creature Eldrazi. It's a 5/5, and it says that you untap Endbringer during each other player's untap step. You can tap it to deal 1 damage to any target. You can pay 1 and tap it to have target creature can't attack or block this turn, or you can pay 2 and tap it to draw a card. So a lot of flexibility here. I know that it's actually not an artifact creature. It's a little bit odd. It is an Eldrazi. There's going to be 2 of them in the deck, just to give you a heads up. We also have Voltaic Servant in this list. This is 2 mana for an artifact creature construct. It is a 1/3, and it says at the beginning of your end step, untap target artifact. So you can untap maybe one of your other artifact creatures, or maybe one of your mana rocks, utility pieces, you name it. The second Eldrazi in this list is Thought-Knot Seer. This is 3 and a colorless mana for a creature Eldrazi. It is a 4/4 and says whenever it enters the battlefield, target opponent reveals his or her hand. You may choose a non-land card from it and exile that card. It also says that whenever it leaves the battlefield, target opponent draws a card. Kind of important to note here, you don't actually have the opponent draw the card that you originally took something from, so don't be afraid to make enemies with a card like this. Plus, on its own, it's nice to be able to see that you have a little bit of disruption, maybe take away their kill spell that they could have otherwise used on Graaz. Next up, we have Shimmermere. This is 3 mana for an artifact creature Mirror. It is a 2/2 with flash and says that you may cast artifact spells as though they had flash. We have Hope of Girapur in this list. This is a single mana for a legendary artifact creature Thopter. It's a 1/1 with flying and says that you may sacrifice Hope of Girapur until your next turn. Target player who was dealt combat damage by Hope of Girapur this turn can't cast non-creature spells. And lastly, in this category of just kind of general good stuff, we have Canopect Spider. This is 5 mana for an artifact creature spider. It's a 4/4 with flying, and it says Fabricator Claw Array. That means whenever another non-token artifact creature or a vehicle enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. Very powerful draw engine in a deck like this. The next 3 cards that we're going to talk about are going to help to make sure that our artifacts come out a little bit faster, or at least that we are maintaining tempo with our opponents. So the first one here is Foundry Inspector. This is 3 mana for a 3/2 artifact creature construct. It says, artifact spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Joyra's Familiar is 4 mana for an artifact creature bird. It has flying and is a 2/2. It says historic spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Historic spells are artifacts, legendaries, and sagas. Lastly here, although it doesn't make your stuff any cheaper, it does kind of slow your opponents down. That is Lodestone Golem. This is 4 mana for a 5/3 artifact creature golem. It says non-artifact spells cost 1 more to cast. We have a couple creatures in this list that are pretty good at making tokens. That way, if we do have the ability to go wide with Graaz, we can make lots of 5/3s. The first one here is Hangerback Walker. Hangerback Walker costs XX for a 0/0 artifact creature construct. It says that it enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. It also says that whenever it dies, you create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying for each +1/+1 counter on Hangerback Walker. Lastly, it's got an ability where you can pay 1, tap it, and put a +1/+1 counter on Hangerback Walker. This is a really powerful card in a deck like this. Not only does it allow you to go wide, but since it's going to be entering play technically as a 0/0 with all those +1/+1 counters on it, if you do happen to have Graaz in play, it'll enter as a 5/3 with all those +1/+1 counters on it. So it makes it even bigger. Thopter Assembly is 6 mana for an artifact creature Thopter. It's a 5/5 with flying and says at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control no Thopters other than Thopter Assembly, return Thopter Assembly to its owner's hand and create 5 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature tokens with flying. And we have Mirror Battlesphere in here. This is 7 mana for an artifact creature Mirror construct. It's a 4/7 and says that whenever it enters the battlefield, you create 4 1/1 colorless Mirror artifact creature tokens. It also says whenever Mirror Battlesphere attacks, you may tap X untapped Mirror that you control. If you do, Mirror Battlesphere gets +X/+O until end of turn and deals X damage to the player or planeswalker that it is attacking. This deck is incredibly expensive in terms of mana value. We've got a ton of very high drop creatures. So we want to make sure that we can get them out as fast as possible. We also want to make sure that we have plenty of small creatures in the deck that Gaz can turn into those 5/3s. So we have quite a few creatures that are going to help us out with our ramp package. The first one here is Hedron Crawler. This is 2 mana for an artifact creature construct. It is a 0/1 that you can tap to add a colorless mana to your mana pool. We have Thran Spider, which is 3 mana for a 2/4. It's an artifact creature spider with reach. It says whenever it enters the battlefield, you and target opponent each create a tapped Power Stone token. It also has, you can pay 7, look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal an artifact card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. This is going to be giving one of your opponents a Power Stone token, so do keep that in mind. However, you need it probably more than what your opponents do. Plague Mirror costs 2 mana for an artifact creature effect, Phyrexian Mirror. It is a 1/1 with Infect, and you can tap it to add a colorless mana to your mana pool. Probably not interested in ever actually swinging with this thing, at least not until it becomes a 5/3, but I do love that it has the ability to at least tap and add that mana. Similarly, we have Mannequin in this list. This is 2 mana for a 1/1 artifact creature construct that you can tap and add 1 colorless mana. Solemn Simulacrum is 4 mana for an artifact creature golem. It's a 2/2 and says whenever it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land card, put that card onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. It also says whenever Solemn Simulacrum dies, you may draw a card. Walking Atlas is in this list. This is 2 mana for a 1/1 creature construct. You can tap it, and you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. Palladium Mirror is 3 mana for an artifact creature mirror. It is a 2/2 that you can tap to add 2 colorless mana to your mana pool. Ornithopter of Paradise is 2 mana. It is a 0/2 with flying, and it says that you can tap it to add 1 mana of any color. And lastly here is Mycosynth Golem. This is 11 mana, but it is an artifact creature golem. It's a 4/5, and it has affinity for artifacts. Affinity for artifacts, just in case you don't remember, says that it costs 1 less to cast for each artifact that you control. It also says that artifact creature spells you have affinity for artifacts. So it does not only reduce its overall cost, but it'll also make sure that all of your other artifact creatures come down much, much earlier. And in many cases, I've noticed Mycosynth Golems just kind of makes the rest of your creatures free. We have a little bit of a recursion package in this list. We are going to be running Junk Diver. This is 3 mana for an artifact creature bird. It's a 1/1 with flying. It says whenever it dies, return another target artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. Scrap Trawler is 3 mana for a 3/2 artifact creature construct. It says whenever Scrap Trawler or another artifact you control is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, return to your hand target artifact card in your graveyard with lesser mana value. And Mirror Retriever is 2 mana for an artifact creature mirror. It is a 1/1 and says that whenever it dies, return another target artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. We have 2 more creatures in this list to kind of wrap up the rest of the package, and both of these are generally just going to be big beaters. The first one here that we have is Steel Hellkite. This is 6 mana for an artifact creature dragon. It is a 5/5 with flying. It also has an ability where you may pay 2 to give it +1/+0 until end of turn, or there is another ability where you can pay X and destroy each non-land permanent with mana value of X whose controller was dealt combat damage by Steel Hellkite this turn. Activate only once each turn. So Steel Hellkite really important to a list like this because with us playing a colorless list, we really don't have options in terms of board wipes. Steel Hellkite kind of acts as a pseudo board wipe to at least help to limit what our opponents are doing. The last creature in this list is Wormcoil Engine. This is 6 mana for a 6/6 artifact creature Phyrexian Worm. It's got both Death Touch and Lifelink, and it says whenever it dies, you create a 3/3 colorless Phyrexian Worm artifact creature token with Death Touch and another 3/3 with Lifelink. So it kind of splits itself. Really powerful card, wonderful value, especially considering that Graaz will be able to pump up those tokens. Moving over to the sorceries, we actually are only running 2 in the entire list. The first one here is All Is Dust. All Is Dust is a tribal sorcery that comes in at a gigantic 7 mana. It says each player sacrifices all colored permanents he or she controls. The wonderful thing about this card in this list is that you are running a grand total of 0. You have absolutely no colored permanents. So this should function as a essentially kind of like a one-sided board wipe. You're not going to hit any of your own stuff with this. Next up, we also have Environmental Sciences. This is 2 mana for a sorcery. It is a lesson. It says search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, and put it into your hand, then shuffle. You gain 2 life. We're not playing any green, so that means we don't get a whole lot of options whenever it comes to ramp. So Environmental Sciences is about as good as we're going to get. I do think that this card is still really important in a list like this. Moving on, we're going to dive into some of the artifacts that are going to help to support this deck. The first category that we're going to talk about here are all going to be focused about mana production. So listed here, we do have Soul Ring, Thought Vessel, Mind Stone, and Felwar Stone. I'm not going to talk about these because I feel like I kind of go over them so often. However, we do have 3 other pieces here that I don't really talk about very often, so I will at least dive in and explain my reasoning for those. The first one that we're going to talk about is Guardian Idol. This is 2 mana for an artifact. It says Guardian Idol enters the battlefield tapped. You may tap it to add a colorless mana, or you can pay 2 mana and it becomes a 2/2 column artifact creature token until end of turn. So it's a mana rock whenever you need it to be. It's also a creature whenever you need it to be, so long as you can pay for it. Hedron Archive is 4 mana for an artifact. You can tap it to add 2 colorless mana, or you can pay 2, tap it, and sacrifice it to draw 2 cards. This deck definitely benefits from having the option to have some card draw and that flexibility, especially at the mana ramp position, so I love Hedron Archive in this list. Lastly, a card that I probably never would include in just about any other deck is Worn Power Stone. This is 3 mana for an artifact. It says it enters battlefield tapped, and later on you can tap it to add 2 colorless mana to your mana pool. Now, I'm not a big fan of Worn Power Stone, generally speaking, but in a list that doesn't care about any kind of color, this does ramp you for 2, but it is still a little bit more on the expensive side, coming in at 3 mana for a mana rock. We do have a couple of other cards in here designed to help get us mana. These next ones, however, not functioning as mana rocks themselves, but more so kind of giving us mana through alternative means. The first one here is Armillary Sphere. This is 2 mana for an artifact. You can pay 2, tap it, sacrifice it, and search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, reveal them, put them into your hand, and then shuffle your library. Next up here, we have Blinkmoth Urn. This is 5 mana for an artifact. It says, at the beginning of each player's pre-combat main phase, if Blinkmoth Urn is untapped, that player adds a colorless mana to his or her mana pool for each artifact he or she controls. Your opponents are going to be generating mana off of this card as well. However, they should probably only be generating a little bit, whereas you can easily generate 8 or more mana off a card like this. So, although you are helping them out, I do think that the trade-off there is worth it. Expedition Map is a single mana for an artifact that you can pay 2, tap it, sacrifice it, search your library for a land card, reveal it, and put it in your hand, then shuffle. Expedition Map is probably the best of any of these kinds of effects because you don't actually have to grab a basic land. You can grab whichever kind of land you'd like, and there are some really fun lands in this deck. We'll talk about those here in just a moment. Lastly here, we do have Wayfarer's Bauble. This is a single mana for an artifact. You can pay 2, tap it, and sacrifice it to search your library for a basic land card, put it on the battlefield, tap, then shuffle. Some of the other artifacts we're going to include in here, we do have a couple of equipment. These are equipment that are either going to be thrown onto Graaz to make him more of a pain in the butt to deal with, or just equipment that are generally good on their own that are going to help us out with our game plan. The first one here is Commander's Plate. This is 1 mana for an artifact equipment. It says that the equipped creature has +3/+3 and protection from each color that's not in your commander's color identity. That's wonderful because our commander has no colors in his color identity, so that equipped creature would have protection from all colors. It also has the equip cost for a commander of just 3 and the equip cost for any other creature for 5. Nettlecyst is 3 mana for an artifact equipment. It has Living Weapon, which means that whenever it enters the battlefield, you'll create a 0/0 Black Phyrexian Germ creature token, then attach it. It also says that the equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each artifact and or enchantment you control, and it has an equip cost of 2. We have a ton of artifacts, so Nettlecyst should hopefully be able to boost the power and toughness of that creature by a very considerable amount. Lastly here, we do have Sword of the Animist. This is 2 mana for a legendary artifact equipment. It gives the equipped creature +1/+1, and also says whenever the equipped creature attacks, you may search your library for a basic land card, put it on the battlefield, tapped, and then shuffle your library. It has an equip cost of 2. We have several artifacts that are going to make the list because of their general utility. These are going to be cards that I do think are pretty important to include in a list like this one, but they all kind of function on their own little way and help us out in, well, various different ways. The first one here is Eye of Vecna. This is 2 mana for a legendary artifact. It says whenever it enters the battlefield, you draw a card and lose 2 life. It also says at the beginning of your upkeep, you may pay 2 mana. If you do, you draw a card and lose 2 life. Card draw in Colorless is really something that it does struggle with. So to see that we have a card like this that not only can cantrip just from casting the thing the first time, but also provides us with the later on ability for us to just continue to draw cards on that is really powerful. The life loss at some point might get to be quite a bit, but ultimately this is a deck that does need it. We have Forsaken Monument, which costs 5 mana for a legendary artifact. It says that colorless creatures you control get +2/+2. Whenever you tap a permanent for a colorless, you add an additional colorless, and whenever you cast a colorless spell, you gain 2 life. So we love everything that this card does. Gonti's Aetherheart is 6 mana for a legendary artifact. It says whenever it or another artifact enters the battlefield under your control, you get 2 energy counters. You may pay 8 energy counters and exile Gonti's Aetherheart to take an extra turn after this one. It is a one-shot only artifact. You do have to exile it out after its ability. However, if you do happen to have several of your Juggernauts in play, hopefully this does allow you to just win the game. Mirage Mirror is 3 mana for an artifact with an ability that you can pay 2 and have it become a copy of target artifact, creature, enchantment, or land until end of turn. That does provide a lot of flexibility. So you can kind of just play around with Mirage Mirror. If there is something on the battlefield that you need a copy of, Mirage Mirror, for the most part, should be able to hit it. Mystic Forge is 4 mana for an artifact that says that you can look at the top card of your library at any time. You may cast the top card of your library if it's an artifact card or a colorless non-land card. And then you can also tap it, pay 1 life, and exile out the top card of your library, hopefully allowing you to chain some stuff together. Mystic Forge, although not directly card draw, is a wonderful card advantage engine that can do wonders in a deck like this. Staff of Nin is 6 mana for an artifact. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, draw a card, and you can tap it to have it deal 1 damage to target creature or player. The pinging effect I know isn't really the most important or impactful thing, but being able to draw a card without any additional cost at the beginning of your turn is really powerful. Next up, we have the Might Stone and the Weak Stone. This is 5 mana for a legendary artifact, Power Stone. It says that whenever it enters the battlefield, you'll choose 1. It has 2 modes. The first one is that you'll draw 2 cards, and the second is that target creature gets -5/-5 until end of turn. Both of those are wonderful. The deck is relatively light on removal and card draw, so whichever of the 2 you feel like is more important given the situation is what you should probably be going with. And then past that point, you can tap it to add 2 colorless mana to your mana pool. That mana can only be spent to cast artifact spells, but that's totally fine considering almost everything in this deck is. Lastly, here in just kind of general value town, we do have Trading Post. Trading Post is 4 mana for an artifact that you can pay 1 and tap it to discard a card and gain 4 life. You can pay 1 and tap it, pay 1 life, and create a 0/1 goat creature token. You could pay 1, tap it, sacrifice a creature to return target artifact card from your graveyard to your hand, or you can pay 1, tap it, and sacrifice an artifact to draw a card. Just so much flexibility with Trading Post. This card is wonderful on this list because of just all the different holes that it helps to fill. We also have Maskwood Nexus in here as just kind of a single artifact that is just a token producer on its own. For 4 mana, you get an artifact that says creatures you control are every creature type. It also says that the same is true for creature spells that you control and creature cards that you own that aren't on the battlefield. Now, I do know that that is pretty much irrelevant in a card in a deck like this because Graaz makes all of them Juggernauts anyways. It does, however, have an ability on it where you can pay 3 and tap it to create a 2/2 blue shapeshifter creature token with Changeling. That's great because later on, so long as your commander's in play, is pumping out 5/3s for 3 mana. To help support this deck, we do have 4 Planeswalkers in the list, the first of which being Karn Living Legacy. This is 4 mana for a Planeswalker that enters with 4 loyalty. Its first ability is a +1 that says create a tapped Power Stone token. Its second ability is a -1 that says pay any amount of mana. Look at that many cards from the top of your library, then put one of those cards into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So a little bit of card draw, a little bit of card advantage there. Lastly, he does have an ultimate at -7 that says you get an emblem with tap an untapped artifact you control. This emblem deals 1 damage to any target. We're also going to throw in Karn, Scion of Urza. This is 4 mana for a legendary planeswalker. It's Karn, and it has 5 loyalty to start. His first ability is a +1 that says reveal the top 2 cards of your library. An opponent chooses one of them. Put that card into your hand and exile the other with a silver counter on it. You have a -1 ability that says put a card you own with a silver counter on it from exile into your hand. And a -2 that says create a 0/0 colorless construct artifact creature token with this creature gets +1/+1 for each artifact you control. That last mode there is very powerful in a list like this. Those constructs are going to be huge. We have Ugin the Ineffable in this list. This is 6 mana for a legendary planeswalker Ugin. He enters with 4 starting loyalty and says that colorless spells you cast cost 2 less to cast. It also has a +1 that says exile the top card of your library face down and look at it. You create a 2/2 colorless spirit creature token. And it also says whenever that token leaves the battlefield, put the exiled card into your hand. He's got a -3 that says destroy target permanent that is 1 or more colors. So not only helps to kind of pseudo draw, make your more creatures, helps to ramp you, and then also serves as removal. Ugin the Ineffable is a must-have in a deck like this. To cap off the Planeswalkers, we've got the Big Daddy himself, Ugin the Spirit Dragon. This is 8 mana for a legendary Planeswalker Ugin. It enters with 7 loyalty. Its first ability is a +2 that says it deals 3 damage to any target. Its second ability is a -X. It says exile each permanent with converted mana cost X or less. That's 1 or more colors. This is a massive one-sided repeatable board wipe that you can just use over and over and over again. Ugin is incredibly powerful. He's very difficult to get rid of, has a massive amount of starting loyalty, and will easily take over a game if your opponents can't deal with him. Lastly, to make all of this even more impactful, we're still not done with the card. It's got a -10 for an ultimate that says you gain 7 life, draw 7 cards, then put up to 7 permanent cards from your hand onto the battlefield. So a massive tempo swing there, going to be able to completely restock your hand and then potentially just overwhelm your board state. Now, one of the big downsides of playing with a colorless deck is that you don't have access to many of the really more powerful or more important interaction spells or many of the ramp pieces. However, one of the advantages of playing in a colorless deck is that all of those wonderful utility cards that you probably would have loved to have played tons of in your other decks that do have multiple colors, well, there's actually no downside for just jamming all of them here. So normally you have to kind of keep in mind that you can only play a handful of them because you still need to be able to make sure the colors of your deck are up and running. We don't have to worry about that here. So the first card we're going to be talking about as far as lands go is Command Beacon. Command Beacon can tap for a colorless mana. You can also tap it and sacrifice it to put your commander into your hand from your command zone. Very important because if we're casting our commander from our hand, we're going to be able to dodge its commander attacks. And with a commander that starts off at 8 mana, that's going to be pretty important. Darksteel Citadel is an artifact land with Indestructible that you can tap to add 1 mana to your mana pool. Field of Ruin is a land that you can tap to add 1 colorless mana, or you can pay 2, tap it, sacrifice it, and destroy target non-basic land that opponent controls. Then each player searches their library for a basic land card, puts it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffles. Do keep in mind, if you blow up opponent A's land, opponent B and C will still be able to get to fetch. Field of the Dead is a land that enters the battlefield tapped. You can tap to add a colorless mana to your mana pool, and it says whenever Field of the Dead or another land enters the battlefield under your control, if you control 7 or more lands with different names, you'll create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. So token production on a land, very powerful. We have Inventor's Fair, which is a legendary land that says at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 3 or more artifacts, gain 1 life. You can tap it to add 1 colorless to your mana pool. You can also pay for, tap it, and sacrifice it to search your library for an artifact card, reveal it, put it in your hand, then shuffle your library. It says activate this ability only if you control 3 or more artifacts. Brand new land card that just came out from Phyrexia All Will Be One. We're going to be playing with Mirrex in this deck. This is a land sphere. You can tap it to add a colorless mana to your mana pool. You can tap to add 1 mana of any color, but activate only if Mirrex enter the battlefield this turn. You can also pay 3 mana and tap it to create a 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Might artifact creature token with Toxic 1, and this creature can't block. Mutavault can tap to add a colorless mana. You can also pay 1 mana and have Mutavault become a 2/2 creature with all creature types until end of turn. It is still a land. We're also going to be throwing Crawling Barrens into this list as well. This is a land that you can tap to add a colorless mana to your mana pool. It's got another ability on it where you can pay it for. Put 2 +1/+1 counters on Crawling Barrens. Then you may have it become a 0/0 elemental creature until end of turn. It is still a land. So a couple of creatures there that either produce tokens for us or that actually just function as potential creatures whenever we need them to. We also are going to include Reliquary Tower. You can tap it to add a colorless mana, and it says that you have no maximum hand size. As well as Rogue's Passage. Rogue's Passage you can tap for a colorless mana, or you can pay for and tap it to have target creature can't be blocked this turn. We have Scavenger Grounds included in this list. This is a land desert. You can tap it for a colorless mana. Or you can pay to tap it, sacrifice a desert, and exile all cards from all graveyards. Super important, you can tap and sacrifice itself to be able to neuter those graveyards in case that's going to be something that you need to deal with. Seagate Wreckage is a land that taps for a colorless mana, or you can pay 2 and a colorless and tap it and draw a card. It says activate this ability only if you have no cards in your hand. Shrine of the Forsaken Gods is a land that you can tap to add 1 mana to your mana pool, or you can add 2 mana to your mana pool, but you can only spend this mana to cast colorless spells or activate this ability if you control 7 or more lands. So do keep in mind, it will help you out a little bit, but this is not a ramp spell by any means. It's not going to help you get Graaz out sooner, but it might help you to recast him maybe later on down the road. War Room is a land that can tap for a colorless mana. You can also pay 3, tap it, and pay life equal to the number of colors in your commander's color identity to draw a card. In a deck like this, you just simply pay 3, you lose no life, you tap this card, and you'll draw a card. We are also going to include Strip Mine in this list. This is a land that you can tap to add a colorless mana to your mana pool, or you can tap it, sacrifice it, and destroy target land. Similarly, we are going to be running Wasteland here as well. This is a land that you can tap for a colorless mana, or you can tap it, sacrifice it, and destroy target non-basic land. Zhalfirin Void is a land that says whenever it enters the battlefield, you'll scry 1, and you can tap to add a colorless mana to your mana pool. And then lastly, one of the best things about playing in a colorless deck is that it gives you the excuse to play with the Urzatron lands. So we're going to be throwing all 3 of those in here. The first of which, in the case you're unfamiliar, is Urza's Power Plant. This says you can tap to add 1 colorless mana to your mana pool. If you control Urza's Mine, Urza's Tower, and Urza's Power Plant, add 2 colorless mana to your mana pool instead of 1. Urza's Mine essentially does the exact same thing that Urza's Power Plant does. Taps for 1 on its own, and taps for 2 in the case you got the other ones in play. And then Urza's Tower comes in, taps for 1 on its own, and will tap for 3. In the case you have both the mine and the power plant in play as well. So 3 lands, they'll tap for 1 mana each on their own, but if you get all 3 in play, they tap for a total of 7. And to wrap up the rest of the mana base, we're going to be throwing 16 Wastes in as our basic land package. Now, Graaz Unstoppable Juggernaut is a ton of fun. This is a deck that actually does do a pretty good job of ramping, despite the fact that it is colorless, so you don't have access to many of the things you normally would with all like the green toys. With that being said, however, this is a deck that you're going to want to overwhelm your opponents, be able to start swinging in with those 5/3s. This is a deck that is definitely going to be punishing if your opponents start to try to kill off Graaz. just because there's not a whole lot of ways for you to be able to protect him or keep him around in Colorless. So do keep in mind, you may want to be able to just drop him and use him as an overrun effect, not necessarily to keep him around or sitting in play, kind of telegraphing that you're going to swing, but more so drop him and then try to take a single opponent out whenever you know that they might be tapped out or unable to defend themselves. All in all, though, this deck is quite a bit of fun. Do me a huge favor, make sure that you leave some comments down below. How would you have built this deck differently? Are there any cards that we didn't include in this list that you think probably would have gone in here? Is there anything odd, obscure, or maybe something that I overlooked? Make sure that you leave a comment down below for that as well. If you had a different idea in terms of how it is that you'd like to play Graaz, I would also love to hear it. As always, we love all of the support. If you haven't done so already, please make sure that you like and subscribe and follow us on our other social media as well, @GuysThatMagic. And until next time, peace.